You are listening to HOA Justice Stories. The survey stakes turned into a fight. I will not be talked over. Ruth Hall pointed at the 6-inch retaining edge running along my back property line and yelled that my new fence touched it, and that was encroachment. I stood there with my car key fob clenched in my fist, because I had 15 minutes before my shift started at the job site, and I was not about to let her make me late. She had her thin reading glasses perched on her nose for dramatic effect, and she kept jabbing her finger at the dirt like she was conducting an orchestra. The fence posts were set 2 feet inside my line, exactly where the survey said, and the chain link panels did not even brush the retaining edge. I told her the survey was recorded and she could check it herself. She pulled out her phone with the cracked screen and started filming every inch of the fence line, panning slowly like she was documenting a crime scene. "I do not negotiate with violations," she said, her voice rising. That phrase would come back to haunt her, but I did not know it yet. I told her I had the permit from the city, and the contractor had followed the setback rules to the letter. She ignored me and kept filming, muttering about easements and compliance and how the Millstone Community Association did not tolerate unauthorized structures. I glanced at my watch. 10 minutes now. Ruth was the safety committee chair, which meant she used security as an excuse to harass anyone who did not fall in line. She had been on my case since I moved in 6 months ago, always finding some new violation to cite. First it was the color of my mailbox, then the height of my hedge, then the placement of my trash cans. Every time I fixed one thing, she found another. The Millstone Community Association covered about 200 homes in a neighborhood on the west side of Erie, Pennsylvania, where certain homes got special treatment and everyone knew it. Ruth lived in one of those homes, a big colonial with a wraparound porch that technically violated the same setback rules she was screaming about now. I am a union electrician apprentice, and I work strict job site start times. If I am late, I lose the day and the foreman does not forget it. I told Ruth I had to leave and we could talk later. She stepped in front of my truck and said we could tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works. I felt my jaw tighten. That line, that exact phrase, would become evidence later, but right then it just sounded like a threat. I asked her who was going to tow my truck from my own driveway. She smiled and said the HOA had a vendor relationship with a local towing company, and if I parked in violation of any rule, they would authorize the tow and bill me for it. I told her my truck was in my driveway, not on the street, and she could not touch it. She said the fence was the violation, not the truck, but the truck proved I was home, and ignoring the notice. I asked what notice. She pointed at my front door. I turned and saw a paper taped to the glass, fluttering in the breeze. I had been home all morning and I had not heard a knock. That told me she had staged it while I was in the shower or making coffee, just to create a timestamp that made it look like I was dodging her. I walked over and pulled the notice off the door. It was a compliance violation form with the Millstone Community Association letterhead, printed on cheap copy paper. The violation code was listed as Section 12.4, Fence and Boundary Structures. The fine was $250, due in 14 days, with a note that failure to comply would result in a lien on the property. I read it twice, then looked at Ruth. I told her the fence was permitted and surveyed, and I would not be paying the fine. She said that was my choice, but the lien would go on my title and I would not be able to sell or refinance until it was cleared. That hit me. I had a mortgage refinance inspection scheduled in 3 weeks, and any active dispute note could derail it. I was trying to lock in a lower rate before the market shifted again, and the timing was tight. Ruth did not know that, but she had just found the pressure point without realizing it. I folded the notice and put it in my pocket. I told her I would be filing a formal complaint with the management company and requesting a hearing. She said that was fine. Hearings took months, and in the meantime the lien would be recorded. I asked her how she planned to record a lien before the 14-day payment window even closed. She did not have an answer for that, so she just turned and walked back to her car, still filming with her cracked screen phone. I got in my truck and drove to the job site, but my mind was on that notice the whole way. The fence was legal. The survey was recorded. The city had issued the permit. Ruth was lying about the easement, and I needed to prove it fast before the refinance inspection. I called my real estate agent during lunch break, a guy named Eric who had helped me buy the place and knew the neighborhood politics. He told me that Millstone had a reputation for pressuring neighbors to sign complaints and calling it community support, and that I needed to document everything and get copies of the HOA covenants and the recorded plat. I spent that evening in the county recorder office website pulling up the plat map for my subdivision. The retaining edge Ruth had pointed at was marked as a drainage feature, not an easement, and it sat entirely on my side of the property line. The plat showed my lot extended 5 feet past the edge, which meant my fence was well within my boundary. I saved the file and printed 3 copies. Then I went through my email and found the permit approval from the city, the contractor invoice, and the surveyor report. I put it all in a folder and labeled it Evidence. The next morning I got another notice, this time taped to my mailbox. It was a second violation, this time citing Section 9.2, unauthorized alteration of common area drainage. I read it twice and felt my blood pressure spike. The retaining edge was on my property, not common area, and the plat proved it. Ruth was escalating, and she was doing it fast. I took a photo of the notice with my phone, then peeled it off the mailbox and added it to my evidence folder. I texted Eric and told him I needed a lawyer consult. He sent me a name, a real estate attorney in Erie who handled HOA disputes. I called the attorney that afternoon and explained the situation. He told me that if the HOA was claiming an easement, they had to produce documentation showing the easement was recorded and enforceable. If they could not, the violation was invalid and the lien would not hold. He said I should file a formal records request under Pennsylvania law, asking for copies of the covenants, the easement map, and any board meeting minutes related to my property. He also said I should attend the next board meeting and demand an explanation on the record. I told him the refinance inspection was in 3 weeks. He said that was tight, but if the HOA could not produce the easement documentation, they would have to withdraw the lien or face a lawsuit. I drafted the records request that night, citing the Pennsylvania Uniform Planned Community Act and requesting all documents related to my fence violation and any claimed easements on my lot. I sent it by email to the management company and copied Ruth. I got an auto reply from the management company saying they would respond within 10 business days. I did not get any reply from Ruth. 2 days later, I got a call from my fence contractor, a guy named Mike who ran a small crew and had done good work. He sounded rattled. He said someone from the HOA had shown up at his shop and told him the fence was installed in violation of the covenants and that he needed to remove it immediately or face a lawsuit. I asked him who it was. He said it was a woman with gray hair and a blue cardigan, and she had a clipboard and a phone and she filmed the whole conversation. Ruth. I told Mike to ignore her. The fence was legal, and I had the permit and the survey to prove it. He said he believed me, but he did not want to get dragged into a lawsuit, and if the HOA kept calling him, he might have to pull his crew off any future jobs in Millstone. That was the goal. Ruth was not just targeting me, she was trying to intimidate the contractor so no one would work in the neighborhood without HOA approval. I told Mike I would handle it and asked him to send me a written summary of the conversation, including the date and time and what Ruth said. He agreed. I added it to my evidence folder. That weekend, I went to the mailbox cluster at the front of the neighborhood to check my mail, and I found Ruth standing there with 3 other neighbors. all holding clipboards. It looked like a campaign stop. She was talking in a loud voice about property values and safety, and how unauthorized structures were a threat to everyone. One of the neighbors, an older guy named Tom, saw me and waved. I walked over. Ruth stopped talking and stared at me. I asked what the meeting was about. She said it was a community discussion about compliance, and she was gathering signatures for a petition to strengthen the fence and boundary rules. I asked to see the petition. She held it up but did not hand it to me. The heading said Petition for Enhanced Boundary Enforcement, and there were already 6 signatures. I recognized 2 of the names, both people who lived near Ruth and always voted with her at meetings. I told the group that my fence was legal, permitted, and surveyed, and that Ruth was claiming an easement that did not exist. Tom asked if I had proof. I said I did, and I would be happy to share it at the next board meeting. Ruth cut in and said the meeting was not the place for personal disputes, and that I should work with the management company. I told her I had already filed a records request and I was still waiting for a response. One of the other neighbors, a woman named Lisa, asked Ruth if the HOA had documentation for the easement. Ruth said it was in the covenants and everyone had access to the covenants. Lisa said she had read the covenants and did not remember anything about easements on individual lots. Ruth said it was Section 12.4. Lisa pulled out her phone and opened the covenant PDF. She scrolled for a minute, then said Section 12.4 was about fence height and setback, not easements. Ruth said the setback rule implied an easement. Lisa said that was not how easements worked. Ruth turned red and said she did not have time to argue about legal definitions, and that the petition was moving forward regardless. I asked her how she planned to enforce a rule that did not exist. She ignored me and told the group they could sign the petition or not, but she was submitting it to the board at the next meeting. Tom said he was not signing anything until he saw the actual easement documentation. Lisa agreed. The other 2 neighbors looked uncomfortable and walked away. Ruth folded the clipboard and got in her car, filming the whole scene with her cracked screen phone as she left. I went home and checked my email. Still no response from the management company. I called the attorney and told him what happened at the mailbox cluster. He said it sounded like Ruth was trying to manufacture support for an enforcement action that did not have a legal basis, and that the petition would not hold up if it was based on a false claim. He also said the contractor intimidation was a bigger problem, because it could be construed as tortious interference if Ruth was deliberately trying to stop me from hiring vendors. I asked him what I should do. He said to keep documenting everything and to escalate the records request if the management company did not respond by the deadline. The deadline came and went. No response. I sent a follow-up email, this time copying the entire board and marking it urgent. I cited the 10-day response requirement under state law and said I would be filing a complaint with the Pennsylvania Attorney General Office if I did not receive the documents within 3 business days. I got a response within an hour. It was from the management company director, a woman named Karen, which was confusing because Ruth was also a Karen in spirit. The director said they were still compiling the documents and needed an extension. I replied and said no extension, the law was clear, and I expected the documents by end of business the next day. I got the documents the next afternoon, delivered as a PDF attachment. I opened the file and started reading. The covenants did mention easements, but only for utility access and shared driveways. There was no mention of drainage easements or retaining edges. I scrolled to Section 12.4. It was exactly what Lisa had said: fence height and setback rules. No easements. I went back to the plat map I had pulled from the county recorder and cross-referenced it with the covenant language. There was no easement on my lot. I had my proof. But I still did not know why Ruth was so fixated on my fence. Then I found it, buried in the email metadata. The PDF had been edited 2 days before it was sent to me, and the edit log showed that someone had removed a paragraph from section 12.6. I opened the county recorder version of the covenants and found the missing paragraph. It was a grandfather clause that exempted any structure built before 2010 from the setback rules. Ruth's wraparound porch was built in 2008. If the clause was enforced, her porch was legal. If it was removed, her porch was a violation. Ruth had edited the covenants to remove the clause that protected her own property, and then she started enforcing the new version against everyone else. That was fraud. I took a screenshot of the edit log and saved it in 3 places. Then I called the attorney and told him what I found. He said that was exactly the kind of evidence that would kill the HOA enforcement action, and that I should bring it to the board meeting and demand an explanation on the record. He also said I should file a complaint with the state attorney general because covenant fraud was a prosecutable offense under Pennsylvania law. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 in the evening, held in the community center at the front of the neighborhood. I printed copies of the plat map, the surveyor report, the permit, the contractor statement, the original covenant PDF from the county, and the edited PDF from the management company, with the edit log highlighted. I put it all in a folder and brought it with me. I also brought my phone, because I wanted to record the meeting in case Ruth tried to twist my words later. I got to the community center early and took a seat in the back row. The room filled up fast. I saw Tom and Lisa, along with about 20 other neighbors, including a few people I recognized from the mailbox cluster. Ruth sat at the front table with 4 other board members, all looking serious. The HOA president, a man named Greg, called the meeting to order and started with the usual announcements. Then he moved to new business. Ruth raised her hand and said she wanted to discuss the petition for enhanced boundary enforcement. Greg asked her to explain. Ruth stood up and said that several homeowners had raised concerns about unauthorized structures, specifically fences and boundary alterations, and that she had gathered signatures on a petition to strengthen the enforcement process. She held up the clipboard. Greg asked how many signatures she had. Ruth said she had 12, which was about 6% of the neighborhood. Greg looked skeptical. He asked if the petition was based on any specific violations. Ruth said yes, and she pointed at me. She said I had installed a fence that encroached on a drainage easement and refused to remove it despite multiple notices. I stood up and said that was false. Greg asked me to wait my turn. I said I would be happy to wait, but I wanted it on the record that Ruth was lying about the easement. Ruth turned around and glared at me. She said I was out of order and that personal attacks were not allowed. I said it was not a personal attack, it was a statement of fact, and I had documentation to prove it. Greg told me to sit down and said I would have a chance to speak during the open comment period. The meeting dragged on for another 20 minutes while Ruth presented her petition and the board asked questions. Finally, Greg opened the floor for comments. I stood up and walked to the front. I said my name and my address and that I was there to respond to the violation notices I had received. I opened my folder and pulled out the plat map. I said the HOA had claimed my fence encroached on a drainage easement, but the recorded plat showed no easement on my lot. I held up the map and pointed at the retaining edge. I said the edge was on my property, not common area, and the fence was set 2 feet inside my boundary line. Ruth interrupted and said the plat was outdated, and that the easement had been established in a later amendment. I asked her to produce the amendment. She said it was in the covenants. I pulled out the county recorder version of the covenants and said I had read the covenants and there was no amendment. Ruth said I was reading the wrong version. I asked her what the right version was. She did not answer. Greg asked the management company director, Karen, if there was an amendment on file. Karen said she would have to check. I said I had already checked, and there was no amendment, and I had proof that the HOA had edited the covenants to remove a grandfather clause that protected structures built before 2010. The room went silent. Greg asked me to repeat that. I said the covenants had been edited, and I had the edit log to prove it. I pulled out the screenshot and handed it to Greg. He looked at it for a long time, then looked at Karen. Karen said she did not know anything about an edit. I said the edit log showed it was done 2 days before the documents were sent to me, and it was done on the management company server. Karen said she would have to investigate. Greg said the meeting would be paused until the board could review the documents. Ruth stood up and said I was making false accusations, and that the edit log was fabricated. I said she was welcome to check the county recorder office and compare the 2 versions herself. She said she did not have time for that. I said that was fine, I had already done it, and I would be happy to provide copies to anyone who wanted them. Tom raised his hand and said he wanted a copy. Lisa said the same. Greg said he would table the petition until the board could verify the covenant language, and that the enforcement action against my fence was suspended pending review. Ruth was furious. She said the board was letting me manipulate the process and that I was using technicalities to avoid compliance. I said the law was not a technicality, and the HOA could not enforce rules that did not exist. She said I was twisting her words. I said I was quoting her words, specifically the part where she said we can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works. I asked her if she still believed that. She did not answer. Greg ended the meeting and said the board would reconvene in 2 weeks with a full report. I walked out of the community center with Tom and Lisa. Tom said that was the most intense board meeting he had ever seen. Lisa said Ruth had been running the HOA like a personal fiefdom for years, and it was about time someone called her out. I said I was just protecting my property, but I appreciated the support. Tom said he had a feeling this was not over, and that Ruth would find some other way to retaliate. I said I was ready. 2 days later, I got a call from Mike the contractor. He said someone had filed a complaint with the city inspector, claiming the fence was built without a permit. I told him that was false, I had the permit, and I had already shown it to Ruth. He said the inspector was coming out anyway, and he wanted me to be there. I said I would be there and I would bring the permit and the survey. The inspection was scheduled for the next morning. The inspector showed up at 8 in the morning, a middle-aged guy with a clipboard and a tape measure. I met him at the fence line and handed him the permit. He looked it over, then pulled out his tape measure and checked the setback. He said the fence was exactly where it was supposed to be, 2 feet inside the property line, and the permit was valid. I asked him who filed the complaint. He said it was anonymous, but the complaint claimed the fence was on an easement. I showed him the plat map. He said there was no easement shown, and the complaint was invalid. He signed off on the inspection and left. I called the attorney and told him what happened. He said the anonymous complaint was almost certainly Ruth, and that she was escalating because the board meeting had not gone her way. He said I should file a harassment complaint with the management company and document every contact. I said I would, but I wanted to wait until after the board reconvened, because I did not want to give Ruth any excuse to claim I was retaliating. The 2 weeks passed slowly. I got no more notices, no more calls, no more anonymous complaints. Then, 3 days before the second board meeting, I got an email from Karen at the management company. It was short. It said the board had completed its review and determined that the covenant edit was unauthorized, and that the original covenant language would be restored. It also said the enforcement action against my fence was withdrawn, and the lien would not be recorded. I read the email twice, then called the attorney. He said that was a win, but I should still attend the meeting to make sure the board followed through. I showed up at the second meeting with the same folder of documents. The room was packed again, even more people than the first meeting. Ruth sat at the front table, but she looked smaller somehow, like the fight had gone out of her. Greg called the meeting to order and said the board had reviewed the covenant documents and determined that Section 12.4 did not establish any easements on individual lots. He said the enforcement action against my fence was withdrawn and that the board would be conducting an audit of all covenant amendments to ensure accuracy going forward. Then Greg said the board had also discovered that several enforcement actions over the past 2 years were based on the edited covenant language, and that those actions were being reviewed. He said homeowners who had been fined or forced to make changes based on the edited language could file for reimbursement. Ruth shifted in her chair. Greg said the board took the integrity of the covenant seriously, and that any board member found to have participated in unauthorized edits would be subject to removal. Ruth stood up and said she had no knowledge of any unauthorized edits and that the management company was responsible for maintaining the documents. Karen stood up and said the edit log showed the changes were made from Ruth's email account. Ruth said her account must have been hacked. Greg said the board would be investigating, and that Ruth was being asked to step down from the safety committee pending the outcome. Ruth said that was unfair and that she was being scapegoated. Greg said the decision was final. Ruth sat down hard. The room was dead silent. Then Tom stood up and said he wanted to thank me for bringing the issue to light, because he had been fined 2 years ago for a deck that was supposedly in violation of the setback rules. And he had paid the fine and rebuilt the deck at his own expense. He said if the covenant edit was the reason, he wanted his money back. 3 other neighbors stood up and said the same. Greg said they should file reimbursement requests with the management company, and the board would review them. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. I walked out with Tom and Lisa again. Tom said Ruth was finished, and that the board would never let her back on the safety committee. Lisa said the HOA had been covering for Ruth for years, and it was about time they held her accountable. I said I was just glad it was over. But it was not over yet. 2 days later, I got a text from Eric, my real estate agent. He said he had heard from a contact at the county recorder office that the HOA had canceled its vendor relationship with the towing company, and that the company was threatening to sue because Ruth had been authorizing tows without proper board approval. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant Ruth had been using the towing company as a personal enforcement tool, and the board had just found out. He said the lawsuit would probably be settled quietly, but it was another nail in Ruth's coffin. Then I got the final piece. I was going through my email and I found a message I had missed, buried in my spam folder. It was from Mike the contractor, sent the day after the mailbox cluster confrontation. He said he had been reviewing his files and found something strange. He attached a photo. It was a picture of my fence line, taken from the same angle Ruth had used, but the timestamp was wrong. The photo was dated 3 days before the fence was even installed. I opened the image file and checked the metadata. The timestamp had been edited. I took a screenshot and sent it to the attorney. He called me back within an hour. He said the edited photo was proof that Ruth had instructed someone, probably the management company or the towing vendor, to falsify evidence to support the enforcement action. He said that was fraud and it was potentially criminal. He said I should bring it to the board and demand a formal investigation. I said I would, but I wanted to wait until the refinance inspection was done, because I did not want any loose ends that could spill over into the title report. The refinance inspection happened the following week. The inspector walked the property, checked the fence, reviewed the permit, and signed off without any issues. The title company ran a search and found no liens, no disputes, no encumbrances. The refinance closed 2 days later. I locked in the lower rate and saved $300 a month. The HOA dispute was officially off my title. But I was not done. I went to the next board meeting with the edited photo and the metadata screenshot. I waited until the open comment period, then I stood up and said I had new evidence related to the fence enforcement action. Greg asked me to proceed. I said I had discovered that a photo used to support the violation notice had been edited to falsify the timestamp, and that the edit was done to make it look like the fence was installed before the permit was issued. I held up the screenshot. The room went silent again. Greg asked who had taken the photo. I said it was taken from the same angle Ruth had used during her inspections, and the metadata showed it was edited on the management company server. Karen stood up and said she had no knowledge of any photo editing. I said the edit log was clear, and I would be happy to provide a copy to the board and to the Pennsylvania Attorney General. Greg said the board would investigate immediately. Ruth did not say anything. She just sat there, staring at the table. Greg said the board would be conducting a full audit of all enforcement actions initiated by the Safety Committee over the past 3 years, and that any evidence of falsified documentation would be referred to law enforcement. He said the board was also moving to remove Ruth from the Safety Committee permanently, and that she would no longer have any role in HOA enforcement. He said the motion would be voted on at the next meeting, but the decision was effectively final. Tom stood up and said he wanted to make sure the board followed through, because Ruth had been abusing her position for years and this was just the tip of the iceberg. Lisa agreed. Greg said the board took the issue seriously, and that the audit would be thorough. The meeting ended, and Ruth walked out without saying a word. If this sounds familiar, hit that like button and subscribe, because HOA revenge stories do not get better than this. The audit took 6 weeks. The board reviewed every enforcement action Ruth had initiated since she joined the Safety Committee, and they found a pattern. At least 15 homeowners had been fined or forced to make changes based on false or exaggerated violations, and in several cases the documentation had been edited or staged. The board issued a formal apology and announced that reimbursements would be processed for anyone who could provide proof of payment. Ruth was removed from the Safety Committee and barred from holding any HOA leadership position in the future. She tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too strong and no one believed her. The showdown location was not a boardroom. It was the shared Greenbelt edge, where Ruth had first pointed at the retaining edge and yelled about encroachment. I was out there one afternoon checking the fence posts and making sure everything was still level after a storm, when Ruth walked up. She did not have her clipboard or her phone this time. She just stood there, arms crossed, staring at the fence. I asked her if she needed something. She said she wanted to know why I had gone after her so hard. I told her I had not gone after her, I had defended my property, and she had escalated it by lying about the easement and editing the covenants. She said she had been trying to protect the neighborhood. I said she had been trying to control the neighborhood, and there was a difference. She said I did not understand how hard it was to keep standards up when people were constantly trying to cut corners. I said I had followed every rule, every permit, every survey, and she had still targeted me. She did not have an answer for that. I told her the plat map was public record, the covenants were public record, and she could have checked them at any time instead of making up violations and intimidating contractors. She said she had made mistakes. I said editing the covenants was not a mistake, it was fraud, and instructing a vendor to falsify a photo timestamp was not a mistake, it was a crime. She said she never instructed anyone to do that. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshot. I said I had the email chain, the edit log, and the metadata, and I would be happy to show it to anyone who asked. She stared at the screen for a long time, then she turned and walked away. That was the last time I saw her at an HOA event. The board formally canceled the vendor relationship with the towing company after it came out that Ruth had been authorizing tows without board approval and billing homeowners directly. The company threatened to sue, but the board settled quietly, and the relationship was terminated. The HOA hired a new management company. one that had a reputation for transparency and strict documentation standards. The new company conducted a full review of the covenants and corrected all the unauthorized edits. The grandfather clause was restored, which meant Ruth's wraparound porch was legal again, but by that point she had stopped attending meetings and stopped participating in HOA business. The funny karma moment came about 3 months later. I was at the mailbox cluster and I overheard 2 neighbors talking. One of them said Ruth had received a violation notice for her own fence, a small decorative picket fence along her front walkway that was technically 2 inches taller than the covenant allowed. The new management company had flagged it during the audit, and they were enforcing the rule evenly across the neighborhood. Ruth had to cut the fence down and repaint it, and she had to pay a fine for the delay. The neighbor said Ruth had tried to argue that the fence was grandfathered, but the new management company said the grandfather clause only applied to structures built before 2010, and her fence was installed in 2012. Ruth insisted it was an easement issue, but the recorded plat disproved it, and the management company held firm. Tom told me about it later, and he was laughing so hard he almost dropped his mail. He said Ruth had spent years weaponizing the HOA rules against other people, and now the rules were being applied to her and she could not spin it. I said that was how enforcement was supposed to work, fair and even. Tom said it was poetic justice. I agreed. The mortgage refinance went through without any issues, and I locked in the lower rate. The fence is still standing, exactly where the survey said it should be, 2 feet inside my property line and nowhere near any easement. The retaining edge is still there, still on my property, still not an issue. The HOA dropped all enforcement actions and the lien was never recorded. My title is clean, my refinance is done, and my job site start times are back on track. Ruth stepped down from the safety committee, and the board told her to step down, and she could not spin it. The payback came through a records request that exposed contradictions and edits, and once the evidence was out there, the board had no choice but to act. The HOA consequence was that they canceled the vendor relationship tied to the abuse, and the new management company put strict controls in place to prevent it from happening again. The funny karma beat was that Ruth insisted it was an easement issue, and the recorded plat disproved it, not just for my fence but for her own violations too. I kept every receipt, every email, every photo, every timestamp. I kept the plat map, the surveyor report, the permit, the contractor statement, and the screenshot of the edited photo. I kept it all in a folder, and I still have it. If your HOA tries this, keep receipts, and I will see you next time.